Guillermo del Toro is releasing a TV show on October 25th called Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, and in preparation of that, I've been reviewing a bunch of del Toro's older works. Today we're going to do a double feature that focuses on Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage. So why am I combining these two movies? While my research indicates from film buffs that a popular interpretation of del Toro's work is that he has a classic movie trilogy of Kronos, The Devil's Backbone, and Pan's Labyrinth, I'm pairing Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage together in part because of my experience with seeing Pan's Labyrinth one year and then a year later seeing del Toro present The Orphanage. But also, I think the two works are unified in their themes about family, and I also think how they handle supernatural elements and a full arc of storytelling line up very well and are interesting to compare. So Pan's Labyrinth was written, directed, and co-produced by del Toro, so it's a good dip into all things del Toro when he's completely unrestricted. It was mine and most Americans' introduction to del Toro's work. Del Toro describes Pan's Labyrinth as a parable with strong fairy tale elements, and many reviewers see it as a dark version of Alice in Wonderland. I would agree with both of these. If I have one complaint about Pan's Labyrinth, it's that it's way more fun to talk about and break down than it is to watch. I really loved my first viewing experience of Pan's Labyrinth. It was something very special to me, but subsequent rewatches have been less and less enjoyable. It's not a bad movie. There's a lot that's amazing about it, and I definitely suggest everyone watch it once. Now, del Toro was the executive producer on The Orphanage. He helped director J.A. Bayonne secure a budget and time needed to make his debut film, and del Toro is very humble regarding his involvement in the film, stating that he made a few suggestions for some of the scares, the timing of the story, but like the overall idea, screen blocking, and so on was all Bayonetta. One of the things del Toro continually describes about both his executive production and him presenting movies is he sees himself more as a coach than a player. So it's his job to finance, to kind of like block other people who might impede the director's creative vision, but it's not his job to fully take over. I think this makes a great study in what kind of stories and theming appeal to him. When The Orphanage released in the United States, it relied heavily on Guillermo del Toro's name in the marketing and was branded as like a standard horror movie. While this movie has been overwhelmingly reviewed positively, at the time it released, a lot of my peers and friends being really disappointed by the movie, wondering whether or not del Toro had more in him than just Pan's Labyrinth, which I personally just didn't understand at all because I've always loved The Orphanage. It's my favorite of all works that del Toro is related to. And I also think that The Orphanage is a terrifying movie. It's not scary in the way Don't Be Afraid of the Dark is. It is one of those movies that lingers with you and haunts you for a long time after it's done. And I think that is what the issue is in the marketing of The Orphanage as a horror movie. Del Toro is the cinematic gothic master. So I guess we have to ask if Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage are gothic movies, and for me, of course they are. For those who aren't aware, this channel has 9 specific elements that we use to categorize things as gothic. You need at least 3 of these 9 elements to qualify, and if you're looking for the whole list and a breakdown of each of those elements, you should check out the video here. For the first time ever, I'm going to have to give both Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage all 9 of these gothic points. Horror elements, Pan's Labyrinth, like Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, uses a child protagonist to heighten fear. Because I feel like it does have like all this limit on resources to deal with this change and maybe even the fear she has surrounding this new situation she's in, she does use fairy tales, folklore, and magic to help her cope and give her some sense of control. So while she embraces the appearance of fairies and the fawn and the whole story of the underworld, we as viewers have several different potential interpretations of what we're seeing on screen. We can see that these monsters, for example, are actually quite scary looking, and what they're saying might sound to a child like a promise of safety or something better, but to an adult often come off as vaguely threatening. The Orphanage explores more of like a mother-child relationship from the perspective of a mother first fighting for her sick child and then later searching for that child. The story preys on the protective nature that most people have regarding children. You don't have to have a child for your heart to sink immediately when you hear about a child abduction or a missing child story. If he comes back alive, he'll be scarred for life and may have had horrible things happen to him, and chances are more likely that he will come back to his mother dead or won't be found at all. And in that regard, it's not just fear for Simon and the growing belief that he is dead the longer he's missing. There's also a genuine concern for Laura. Her tenacity is bordering on obsession to find her missing son, and that is in parts admirable, disturbing, and concerning for the audience. Both these stories have characters. King in Pan's Labyrinth, it's a personal journey for Ophelia. Her plight and attempt to escape are central focus in the story. Is she reincarnation? Would she be better off living that life? Is that even really an option for her? These are all things that we're wondering about. Pan's Labyrinth does have a lot going on around Ophelia. It's part of what builds tension and concern. And the fact that we know Ophelia isn't really entirely aware of and or doesn't understand all the different drama and tension going around her with the adults is something else that the audience takes on. And Ophelia does go through either a character arc or a moment of self-discovery. At first, she is willing to do anything to return to the king of the underworld, who is supposedly her spiritual father. And all of this culminates in her grabbing her baby brother and bringing him to the heart of the labyrinth. When the faun asks her to use some of his blood so that she can return to the underworld, she refuses. And suddenly she goes from being a character willing to do anything to return to her father to a character that is more interested in protecting her baby brother and the family she has now than finding family long lost. Meanwhile, the orphanage is entirely wrapped up in this mother-son relationship. Early in the movie, we get a lot of look at Simone and his eccentricities and sort of childish, magical, imaginative world. But we also get to meet Laura and see how she fits in with Simone's world. She draws on his imaginative nature by sort of showing him that the lighthouse is secretly still working with like a little trick of the light. She tells him all kinds of ghost stories. She plays along with his game regarding the fairies and finding lost treasure and scavenger hunts. The two of them together seem to live in their own little bubble and have like a very unique way of looking at the world. And it's part of what transforms the orphanage a couple of times throughout the movie. More poetic prose. Both Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage have standard Del Toro moving camera, beautiful scenes, intricate set pieces and costuming, overall haunting visuals. The detail work in Pan's Labyrinth and the uniqueness of the monsters is what really stands out in that movie. But when we're looking at the ghosts in The Orphanage, it's actually how simple they are, how basic things are with them. Even Thomas's mask, all of that is simple and clean and in some ways even ordinary. And that's what makes it stand out and become a transcendent kind of imagery. It's probably apparent in these more poetic prose sections that I don't know a lot about filming technique or design or any of that stuff. I just know what I like to look at and don't like to look at. But I do think that both Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage make great use of the visual medium and that the story is told better as a movie or TV show than it could be told on page. Editing Jess here. Looks like while I was going through all of my gothic points for Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage, I left out elements of loneliness and longing. Both of these movies display it in different ways. With Pan's Labyrinth, Ophelia is literally left to her lonesome quite often. It seems like her mother would like to spend more time with her, but she is pregnant and ill and her husband's demanding some of her time, so Ophelia is often left to explore and wander around on her own. We might even interpret the elements happening in Pan's Labyrinth as the elaborate imaginings of a lonely child. And in The Orphanage, Simone is very similar. He has imaginary friends instead of real ones. It's implied, although never directly stated, that Simone lacks real-world friends because his parents are afraid to send him to school or to interact with his peers because he might get ill. Beyond Simone's loneliness, though, Laura is also a fairly lonely character. After Simone's abduction, she keeps going to new and further depths to try and save her son. She's willing to explore possibilities and opportunities that her husband just can't believe in. And it leaves Laura to travel paths on her own Next is going to be human mortality. In Pan's Labyrinth, Ophelia's mother is sick, and that's like a major subplot within the story, but also whether Ophelia lives or dies, whether she goes to the underworld or not, these are all strong thematic elements. The Orphanage explores human mortality by using Simone as a sickly child. Once he's been abducted and missing for a while, positing whether he could survive that long without his medication or whether he's withering away from his disease. There's also a pretty interesting ghost story exploring the history of the house that Laura's moved to and that she originally lived in as an orphan. She comes to find out while looking for someone that all of the orphan children she knew are dead, and she has to come to terms with how they died shortly after she left, how she didn't know this, and she ends up in her mind connecting these two incidents in a way that maybe she shouldn't have. Next is going to be a supernatural element. Pan's Labyrinth is a fairy tale. They have actual fairies and monsters and fawn, the whole 9 yards, magic and different kinds of creatures. And the Orphanage is a little bit more coy about it. It is definitely a traditional Gothic ghost story centered on the house, where the house is its own character that horrible things happened in and may or may not have left residual memories of. You can see it as a very supernatural movie with a lot of compelling incidents and evidence that indicate life after death. Hey guys, Editing Jess back again, and I am so sorry. A little behind the curtains peek here. I recorded both The Strain and this double feature on the same day, and apparently I was way too tired to even sort of kind of follow along with my script because I skipped right over point number 7, questioning a character's mental health and reality. We see this point in Pan's Labyrinth with Ophelia as a child. We're questioning whether or not everything regarding the fawn and the underworld mythology is all in Ophelia's head or if it's actually real. There's some crossover where we could argue it might be real. For example, Ophelia does put something under her mother's pillow, but we're not really sure if it's the mandrake or if it's just like a pile of garbage and that's why her parents are both so disgusted by it. Ophelia never actually questions her mental reality, but I think there is a strong argument about whether or not the audience buys into what they're seeing or whether they find it compelling on another level as a child's delusion or coping mechanism. Likewise, in the Orphanage, we have a little bit of that same childish imagination. We're left wondering if the imaginary friends Simone has are actually imaginary or if they're ghosts. And we have the medium scene where we're wondering whether or not that medium is interacting with spirits or she's making it up for money as a con job. The Orphanage does do a better job at presenting the possible loss of Laura's reality into like this mental delusion as she searches for her son, because her husband is right there presenting the counter argument that we as the audience might be just thinking in our head. But overall, both of them could be interpreted either way, as a sad story about someone who was delusional and lost their mind and eventually their life, or as someone who was interacting with something truly supernatural and magical and was able to bargain with that magic to get what they wanted in death. Makes use of local folklore and superstition. Both movies create their own kind of like history of the area that they're set in and folklore, superstition. Pan's Labyrinth takes like some traditional underworld elements and makes their own underworld story. It also like uses traditional fairies, fauns, those kind of depictions and swaps them up a little bit to fit their narrative. The Orphanage, Laura has childhood stories that the other orphan kids used to tell each other that she's perpetuating onto Simone. But Simone also has some like classic fairy tale folklore kind of things. He has this connection to Peter Pan and the boy who never grows up. There's also like the idea of the fae or like strange creatures that make deals and take a thing you care about and send you on a scavenger hunt. And lastly is going to be a strong sense of place. Of the two, I think the Orphanage has the stronger sense of place. The house the majority of the movie takes place in is like a character in and of itself, starting with the mini adventure as Laura's a child in the Orphanage all the way up to her adult time there. Where the stairway and the rooms and all that stuff is situated, again, just like in Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, it's very blueprinty. I feel like I could walk there. But even some of the exterior locations like garden, getting to the beach and the sea cave and where the lighthouse is, I just felt like I had a great sense of where that was and the place, and each one of those specific elements had their own like personality and lore and presence to them. Now Pan's Labyrinth, the Labyrinth specifically, does have a pretty strong sense of place and presence. I give Pan's Labyrinth the point, but it's not quite as strong for me as The Orphanage was. Moving on to my observations and jumping right into the visuals, these two movies are really interesting because they're a joy to watch, and they have memorable scenes and props and monsters and costumes. But I think they're the first two movies of Del Toro's where the story and the theming was way more interesting to me than what I was watching on screen. And I'd say past movies that we looked at, like Pacific Rim and Blade 2, were more a celebration of that visual spectacle and flair. And I think sometimes the visuals overshadowed the story. For me, The Strain lacks any kind of visual interest, and I remarked on that instead of the visuals itself. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark is a story to me that can only be told in a visual medium because it relies so heavily on the level of light, positioning of the creatures, and all that kind of stuff just gets lost in the sauce a little bit when it's on page. Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage could both be stories that are transformed into novels, but I do think the visuals that they are given and the perspectives that it allows for make both these stories stronger in a visual medium. If we talk about individual storytelling components, Pan's Labyrinth opens with a prologue and closes with an epilogue, which is kind of exposition-y. The visuals themselves are fine, and because this kind of story is meant to be like a parable, fairy tale, the opening and closing of the book with a prologue and epilogue is sort of like bookending it and reinforcing the original written nature of fairy tales and parables. That said, I don't know that we need either of those components, and part of me would be curious to see how this movie plays without the prologue and epilogue, but some of that has to do with like my style of storytelling. Like, I prefer to just be dropped in it. And I wonder too if some of the reason I think you could do Pan's Labyrinth without the prologue and epilogue and have as good or perhaps a better movie comes from like knowledge I have now about Del Toro's work that I wouldn't have had when I first saw this movie in 2006. My original viewing, I probably appreciated these scenes more than I do now. The Orphanage, on the other hand, has a mini adventure, and it starts us off with Laura as a child right before she gets adopted, playing with all the other orphan kids in the house. And I really love this because it feels like a pretty mundane visual when we first see it, and it becomes more and more important and has callbacks to it throughout the rest of the movie. Overall, I don't have a lot of notes for either story when it comes to their components. The simplicity of each story is part of what really makes the viewer dig deeply into what's happening and engage with the characters in the story. But that means that there's just not as many different things for me to talk about vehicle-wise and how the story was told. Both stories have fairy tale and dreamlike qualities, and both have unreliable narrators that suit the audience's sense of insecurity and uncertainty when watching the films. And I think this is a big benefit to the stories because it allows the storyteller to confidently display the monsters or the ghosts without breaking immersion. Both movies focus on imaginative protagonists and trying to make a deal with the supernatural. And that's a kind of story I really like. I want to give a little shout out to Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. They also use fae creatures and have the fae creatures asking Sally to come play with them and are trying to lead her away. And in this way, I feel like Pan's Labyrinth and Don't Be Afraid of the Dark are two sides of the same coin. Because in Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, we are 100% certain what's going on is nefarious and will only lead to bad things. And in Pan's Labyrinth, we're afraid for Ophelia for all the same reasons that we see in Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. But there's also this hope, and I just love the two different ways those stories can go and how Del Toro does a great job playing it both ways. Meanwhile, in The Orphanage, the ghosts are scary and unknown, but they're never depicted as malicious. And I think that's like a very interesting way to depict ghosts and haunting in general, because usually we see hauntings as something that we have to get rid of or something where the ghost is trying to harm the people. We're worried that Simone was led away by these ghosts or that like Thomas wanted to hurt the children for some reason. We never actually see the ghosts do any damage. We have to wonder why they were there and if they had wanted to help Laura and Simon all along. Both stories have female protagonists, and they're smart and resourceful and compelling and traditionally feminine. And don't get me wrong, I love my warrior girls. Shout out to both Alana the Lioness and Buffy the Vampire vampire slayer. I usually can't talk enough about a girl who kicks ass, but if we're being real for a minute, I am usually the kind of person that chooses and prefers non-violent solutions, and because of that, I tend to relate more in fiction to characters that have non-violent answers to things. And here in a world where like aggression and escalating disagreements is coded as masculine, choosing some kind of non-violent confrontation or negotiation is often coded as feminine. And really the negotiator isn't usually the protagonist of a piece, and sometimes their desire to talk it out is portrayed as cowardly or a waste of time. So it's incredibly refreshing, especially in like a twisted horror fairy tale series, to portray characters as reaching out to antagonistic forces, trying to understand them, and working with them to make smart and heroic choices. I think it works particularly well in this genre because choosing not to struggle against antagonistic forces, both characters and the viewers experience a level of vulnerability and openness that you won't get in most movies, let alone a horror movie. Often characters are shown as particularly stupid or lack empathy, which is how they end up as prey in those horror movies. And if they do haplessly fail into like some ancient evil's trap or whatever, they often choose to fight the monsters or exorcise the ghosts instead of trying to talk with them. And that's part of what makes both Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage so special. The most tragic element in both Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage is how Ophelia and Laura choose to work with the supernatural, and they still end up dead. At first glance, it may seem like Ophelia and Laura are punished for reaching out to the monsters because they do die, but it's worth noting in each of these movies, humans kill our protagonists, not the monsters. Ophelia is shot and killed by her father and left to bleed out alone in Pan's Labyrinth. It's the monsters that come and comfort her and make sure that she does get what she was looking for the whole time. In Laura's case, she chooses to overdose in sleeping pills instead of living in a world without her son. When she begs to be reunited with him, it's the ghosts that create a place for all of them to be happy together in the afterlife. So something that we can see throughout these movies is that humanity is the true monster they devour and consume regardless of one's acts. And perhaps that's why the culture that we've chosen to venerate is the character who comes out swinging. Might makes right. It may not be what we want in society, but it is who we depict as surviving. While family plays a large role in most of Del Toro's work, I look at Pan's Labyrinth and Orphanage as mirrors of each other. In Pan's Labyrinth, we see how far a child is willing to go for her mother and her father. Ophelia is first doing everything she can to protect her mother and to try and cure her from her sickness. And she's also going through all of these different trials to be reunited with her father, who's supposedly king of the underworld. The Orphanage is a story all about what a mother is willing to do to find and rescue her son. There's not a lot I can say about family love and devotion that wouldn't feel pithy or cliche here. I think showing familiar love and devotion through storytelling is probably the most beautiful way it can be depicted and the best way it can be expressed. And oftentimes we hear these words so often they ring hollow. So seeing it on the screen or reading it in a book is really the best way to get it across. And Del Toro does just amazing work. I feel like his work speaks volumes and tells me a lot about him as a person and how he feels about his own family and family relations as a whole. And while both these stories are relatable to like the classic American nuclear family, it is worth noting that both of them show found family, quote-unquote unconventional family. In Pan's Labyrinth, Ophelia loves her biological mother and shows fear for her adoptive father, not because he's not her blood father, but because he is remote and sometimes aggressive with her. As soon as she learns about perhaps a spiritual father or a soul-link father in the king of the underworld, she immediately wants to be reunited with him and shows like an interest and longing for his love and mentorship. And when the fawn suggests that the king of the underworld would love to be reunited with her, Ophelia is willing to do anything to get to him. She never questions why such a powerful force needs her to put in the work. And later, after her mother passes, Ophelia does take her baby half-brother out to the labyrinth. She does this in an attempt to protect him. The only potentially safe place she knows to go is to the center of the labyrinth, where hopefully her father from the underworld will open the gates and let both of them in to be safe. Ophelia meets with the fawn, and he tells her the only way to open the gates of the underworld is for her to hurt her brother and spills some of his blood. And Ophelia refuses, even though she was so desperate to meet her father and gain that love. She shows a loyalty and devotion to her half-brother in this moment, and an understanding and respect for life that even many of the adults around her don't seem to have. And in the orphanage, Laura has adopted Simone, and she was able to adopt him because he is a child who was born with HIV. I know HIV is a lot more treatable and manageable now than it was even in 2007, but this was a very touch-and-go situation for Simone, and there seems to be a lot of fear in the family that even with treatment, Simone could be sick or could possibly die from his illness. Pacific Rim has a whole found family adoption subplot in it. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark. Sally and Kim's connection and relationship is all part of the found family adoptive mother-daughter relationship. And we are going to end up talking more about different kinds of family structures and love and devotion when we discuss Crimson Peak and Mama later on. I do think this family and love theming that we see in these two movies is even more haunting when we realize that both Ophelia and Laura end up dying at the end of their respective stories. Because it tells us that even if you have a deep and unerring love and devotion to your family, and even when that's portrayed as purely a good thing, it doesn't save the people you love or save the people who are risking it all from death. And I'd say this is like a pretty gothy message and ending, and it sort of transforms death from like a final enemy and a worse ending to something more complicated. But it does ask us, like, if the world is in such a state that death is better than life, then what kind of world is that? And is that really the kind of world that we want to be shaping and promoting? And the other thing is, if we do believe that death is better than life, not just for the characters we see in these stories, but for other people as a generalization, that's a pretty problematic message to take away from either story, and is creepy and chilling in its own way. So I would say both Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage are chilling and atmospheric stories. If you're looking for something that's less jump scare and less about battle and more about the risks and horrors that come with day-to-day living and loving and reaching out to other people, either of these movies can suit you for your spooky season needs. If you can only watch one of them, I have to recommend The Orphanage. It is one of my favorite all-time movies, and I think emotionally it's a little bit more of a hit than Pan's Labyrinth is. But if you're looking for like those spooky, creepy monsters, and you're looking for like a twisted Alice in Wonderland kind of vibe, then Pan's Labyrinth might be the way to go. If we're looking at overarching filmography and themes in Del Toro's work, we're still all about those big fantasy sets and lots of interesting visual, especially highly stylized experience with attention to set and costume detail, and where these elements help with world building and character building. We've got a return to the underground here. While not the tunnels in Blade 2 or the breach in Pacific Rim, the goal for Pan's Labyrinth is for Ophelia to be reunited with her dad in the underworld. Underworld being the key word here. And also in Pan's Labyrinth, that labyrinth has a really tunnely feel. I don't think it's actually underground, but it's always dark when they're in there, and narrow kind of corridors that have a lot of similar characteristics. Meanwhile, The Orphanage is all about uncovering buried truths. Metaphorically, there's a lot of caves and tunnels, but we also have like the sea cave. When Laura finds the bodies of her childhood friends, she's literally crawling through a tunnel, and Simone's body is found in Thomas's old room, which is a room that's like below the orphanage. It's just like this creepy underground room. Del Toro also tends to humanize all characters, even the villains. These works stress the importance of family, whether biological or found, and they highlight the power of love and devotion, whether it leads to happy endings or not. Del Toro also champions unlikely heroes and uplifts characters that are more often dismissed. And that's going to be it for my review of both Pan's Labyrinth and The Orphanage. Did you watch either or both of these movies? Tell me what you thought of them in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep reading. Bye!